Okay, I want to talk briefly about opening your eyes, and you'll see what I mean by that soon. So, I was reading The Two Towers today, the second part of The Lord of the Rings, and I noticed something funny. I was reading the scenes where Frodo and Sam meet Faramir, and they're swapping their tales, and Faramir doesn't name Sauron by name. He calls him the Unnamed, or he whom we do not name. And what struck me about that is, hey, that's exactly the same phenomenon that happens in Harry Potter. You know, they call him he who shall not be named, or you know who, but ordinary witches and wizards, they don't say Voldemort's name aloud much of the time. And you may think it's out of sort of odd fear, the sort of terrified respect that comes from looking at absolute evil in the face. But not everyone succumbs to that. Dumbledore calls Voldemort by name, and so do other characters. Dumbledore even calls him Tom, and there's a whole other reason for that, and that's kind of cool. That's important. And also in Lord of the Rings, there are many characters who name the One Ring and who name Sauron, but chief among those perhaps is Gandalf. Of course, Gandalf and Dumbledore are analogous characters, right, in these two stories. Now, I was wondering about that, and well, what does that have to do with opening your eyes and looking at things? Well, if you put a name to something or someone, there's a different trope about knowing someone's name, their true name, being equivalent to having power over them. That comes up in The Inheritance Cycle, the Aragon books by Christopher Paolini, and in many other stories, myths, and sci-fi and fantasy books. But that's not really, it's related, but it's not exactly what I'm talking about. I think in order to name something, you need to be able to distinguish it from other similar things, and you need to be looking at it pretty clearly. You need to be able to draw distinct and sharp borders around it in order to define it. And you can't do that unless you look at it, unless you're willing to zoom in on it and see those fine-grained distinctions. This is true visually, and this is true metaphorically, with defining words and with naming objects and naming people. So I could give examples of that, but that should be pretty self-evident. Now, let's look at another example of what I mean by being willing to open your eyes and look at things, and the way in which doing so is a really, really necessary thing that a lot of folks, like most of the witches and wizards in Harry Potter, and like many of the people and the creatures of Middle-earth, are unwilling to do. They don't want to look at it. They don't want to name it. They don't even want to talk about it. Out of sight, out of mind. They're willfully blind. That's a key phrase to things, and thus they don't understand them. They don't know them, and their fear increases of them. But that's to their peril. So you want to be like Gandalf, and you want to be like Dumbledore. You want to look at and name the evil around you, and anything around you that you need to understand better, even if it's scary to look at. So here's this other example I want to talk about. It's an Egyptian myth, and it's one you may have heard of. It's the story of Osiris and Set and Isis and Horus. I won't tell the whole myth, but I just want to contrast two of the characters. The first is Osiris, and he is a god, but he's also the pharaoh. And he's old, so he's aged, he's out of date, he's a bit obsolete. His way of understanding the world is no longer really in keeping with how things are, because you need to update your way of being, your worldview, with the world itself in order to stay alive and stay young and stay vigorous. So he has that problem, but worse than that, Osiris, he's willfully blind. He could see, but he doesn't. He chooses not to. What doesn't he see? He doesn't see that his evil brother Set is as evil as he is, and is plotting to take over the kingdom. It's very similar to Mufasa and Scar in The Lion King, right? So, in this example, Osiris is like someone who's unwilling to really look at Set or Sauron or Voldemort and say their name. He can't say the name because he doesn't see it clearly, or he can't see it clearly because he's unwilling to name it and distinguish it from the things around it and pull it out of the seamless, overwhelming mass of the sensory input of the world around you and put a nice box around it and give it a name. He's unwilling to therefore see what its characteristics are and be aware of it and understand it. And pick it out from the infinite mass and make it finite and understand it. And so that leads to his downfall. And this is a universal trope in mythology and many stories, that there's natural aging because we're finite mortal creatures. So that aging will do you in, and entropy will do you in. So things fall apart of their own accord. But the trope is that the willful blindness of people accelerates that process of disintegration and decay and aging and death and entropy. This is, for example, one reason for the flood in the Bible, is the sins of men. And to sin was originally a term from archery. It means to miss the mark. So it's like you weren't looking closely enough and you missed. So you were willfully blind. You weren't aiming properly because your eyes weren't all the way open. And looking and seeing and opening your eyes are, of course, analogous to consciousness. Like how conscious, how aware are you? So what happens in the Egyptian myth? Well, Osiris is willfully blind. He doesn't see Set's machinations, and Set is able to dismember Osiris. You can't kill a god, but Set chops him up and scatters the pieces of his body all over the kingdom of Egypt. And then Isis comes along, and there's a whole story there, and she impregnates herself with the remainder of Osiris's phallus, and then she gives birth to a son, and that's Horus. And Horus is the visionary hero. So I want to contrast Horus with Osiris. Horus is a falcon, and he's this visionary hero god, and he can see. That's what falcons do. Human beings anatomically have incredibly good eyesight compared to most other creatures, but we don't see as well as birds of prey. Falcons are among those birds of prey who can see extremely keenly and sharply. And Horus grows up outside the now tyrannized kingdom by his uncle Set, and he can see, and he looks at Set, and he's willing to see Set for who he is, and he returns to the kingdom when he's of age, and he duels with Set, and he beats him, he wins. And something interesting happens. Set tears out one of Horus's eyes during the duel. They're gods, it's a serious fight. They're earth-shaking. And Set tears out one of Horus's eyes. But Horus wins the fight, and he recovers the eye, and he doesn't put it back in his own head. He takes it down to the underworld, where his father, Osiris, is living as a shade. And he gives the eye to his father, and they return to the upper world, and they rule jointly. So it's a happy ending. But the point is that, the point about Horus losing his eye in the fight is that you need to look at evil. You need to look at things you don't want to look at, like Set. But there's a danger there. There's a risk that it will damage your consciousness, because it's serious to look at evil and to look at things you don't want to see. But you have to, if you want to redeem the kingdom, if you want to develop the capacity to be to have sovereignty and be the new god, the new pharaoh, and to revivify your culture, which is what Horus does in the story. He's the hero. So you'll get wounded by it, and it's not fun, but you have to look at evil, and you have to look clearly at it, and you have to name it. And then you have to confront it voluntarily and forthrightly in order to overcome it. So it may damage you, but you have to open your eyes and see and name that around you which you don't want to see. So what does this mean for us on a practical level? Well, all around us there are little versions of these myths and stories. There are little pockets of chaos or of evil, or where you haven't been as good as you could be, where your life isn't straightened out, where you're not put together, you're not in shape. And those could be things like texts that you don't return promptly. So it could be at your phone, and you kind of look at your phone and you don't want to look at that, so you look at it away. Or it could be maybe your bank account. You don't check your bank account because you don't like your financial situation in life. But you can usually put it out of sight, out of mind, and put it off for a little bit. Or it could be something about your job. It could be your relationships. It could be a stack of paperwork. It could be your dirty closet. It could be not just chaos and sort of obvious badness, but it could be pathological or tyrannical order. It could be the fact that your closet is too neat, and that it's embarrassing when people come over to your house and they see how ordered everything is. It could be something like that. But whatever it is, that if you can step back from yourself and you realize what you're avoiding and what you're not naming, what you're not looking at, those are the things, as fearful as they are, that you have to look at and open your eyes if you want to take that heroic leap to make your life better, and to put things back together and to bring them to a higher state of being. You need to shine the light of your consciousness on them into the dark corners and recesses of yourself and of your community. So open your eyes.